All right. Hello, hello. There we go. So a couple of things. I always start off saying a couple of things. So last week, I had pants on. And I said, well, I'll tell you why. Well, of course, why was because of Sharon's review, and it was her last review. But I did get the call earlier in the week about not wearing shorts. So I said, yeah, Mom, I won't wear shorts. Well, I already knew I wasn't going to. Well, it's so blazing hot out there today, I just thought, you know what? Nobody's retiring tonight, so I don't care. And then, instead of, I always feels like I always talk about the heat. I put that thing up there about, the little message to July. Well, clearly July didn't pay attention to what I had said. And I was driving around today, and I was driving by Caruth Park, and I saw, I guess, what must be the Texas version of a slip and slide. So, you kind of know how hot it is when, hopefully there are no kids in that little thing there, right there. But anyway, I'm going to get out of here pretty quick because we have a great night tonight with Dana. So I am going to turn the microphone over to Stephanie Newland, who's going to welcome us and pray, and then she's going to turn it over to Petrella Booker, who will introduce Dana Harkey. So everybody have fun, and I'll see you for a couple of minutes at the end.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Stephanie Newland, and I'm the director of our Belong Disability Ministry, housed in the Tolleson across the way, and I'm here to welcome you all. Hopefully you all know about our documentary that's making its way through the film festivals right now. Reverend Paul is in California this week representing us over there, so I'm hopeful that you all will get an opportunity to see Into the Spotlight sometime soon, so stay tuned. That's just one of the many great things that we're up to over at Belong. So will you pray with me? Dear Lord, thank you for the gift of today, the gift of opportunity to be together, to learn from you, to learn from those whom you speak through. Bless this time, bless this hour, bless the minds. May they absorb all of the messages that propel us to do your will, Lord, when we exit these doors. May you bring us some cooler weather. May you bring us joy. May you especially lift up all of those who are hurting, lonely, without friendship, companionship, without shelter in this heat, Lord. Bless this evening and all of the minds in the room. In your name we pray. Amen. And I'll turn it over to Miss Booker.
Well, good evening. Oh my goodness, it is so lovely to look out and see all these beautiful faces. And my goodness, you look like you're not even melting. Fantastic. Well, I have the honor and the privilege of telling you a little bit about Dana, but I'd first like to introduce myself. My name is Petrella Booker, and I happen to be the lay pastor of Cox Chapel. How many of you all know where Cox Chapel is? Amen. Have you noticed how beautiful it is? How elegant it is? But more importantly, if you walk in, you can just sense the power of prayer in there. There's been so many people praying over the years in that space. When you have an opportunity, I hope that you will come on a morning. We start at 8:30. If you'd like to just come and just experience what it's like to return to a liturgical service. Does anybody remember what that is? But we have communion every Sunday, and I have the honor and privilege of working with just a wonderful team. As a matter of fact, our minister is here tonight, Reverend Tripp Gulledge. He's over here to our right. Can you wave your hand, Tripp? And we have several members of our Cox Chapel ministry right over there. Hello. And But I wanted to share that with you is because just like this, us being here tonight at Rejebian, it's about building fellowship and community. And so that's the heart of who Cox Chapel is. And come and visit. We'd love to have you. Outside of my role there, I also serve in the pastoral care department, and so I'm responsible for the care classes that we offer 2 times a year. So that's a little bit about me. Now I want to share a little bit about, and I think I can say this, Dana is a friend. And if you've ever met her, you would probably say she's your friend too, because she's always genuinely interested in learning more about you. And if you are involved in any type of social justice type of activities around not only here in Dallas, but worldwide, she has an interest in it. And so let me just share a little bit about my friend, Dana. There's something that I thought was very interesting about her, and that is she has been a reviewer for over 10 years. Isn't that amazing? You really have to know your stuff and understand a book, so that tells us that she's an avid reader. But she loves to review books and talk about history, women, art, and adventures. And she's able to do that because she went right over there, SMU, go Ponies. As a matter of fact, she is a Golden Mustang and an avid SMU sports fan. But she started out with humble beginnings, being raised in Arkansas, and growing up in Lodge's Corner United Methodist Church, where she and her family, they were the church. And if you know her, she knows Methodist polity like nobody's business. Amen, and I'm grateful for that. I can always call on her. Her husband, Jackson, I don't know where we would be without Jackson in Cox Chapel, and we're really grateful for her husband. She and Jackson met through Billy Boyd Smith while he was driving a bus to Lake Sharon. And so I have to say, Jackson was on a mission. And so he invited his lovely wife to come along with her. But they have been together, and as a matter of fact, they just celebrated 50 years of marriage. Can we say amen? They have 2 wonderful children, Blake and Amanda, and they are very involved in the life of Cox Chapel. That says a lot about them, and as a matter of fact, you will see their spouses come along with them to several and many of our activities. So Blake's wife is Hannah, and Amanda's husband is Rob. And we're very blessed to have these 2 beautiful, intelligent, but rambunctious youngsters that I just love to see. They make my day, and that's Eleanor and Andrew and Dub. We just love having them there in our service. But a little bit more back to her. She's very passionate about Wesley Rankin United Methodist Church, and she has served in our Sunday school. One of them, I want to say, has served faithfully at Wesley Rankin Community Center for over 40 years. And so that says a lot about her heart. She's been awarded several times the Jackson and the Hattie Rankin and Moore Leadership Award. And with her sister, Rita, I think I saw her husband here, they were awarded the Georgia Bates Award, and I think that was just a couple of years ago. So that's talking about just a little bit about her. Now you'll have an opportunity, without further ado, for me to introduce the lovely, wonderful, social service, yes, I'm going to lay it out. Social service, social justice conscious, my friend, Dana Harkey.
Thank you, Petrella. Thank you. I just knew David was going to bring a picture of him as about a 5-year-old child sitting on Jane's lap, and she's reading Curious George to him. I was a little disappointed in the fiery slide, but maybe we can work on that for next week. Surely that picture exists somewhere, David, right? Somewhere. I really like this book. I was just talking to Amy Berry, and she's about halfway through it too. This guy has such a sense of humor. Bruce Handy, the author of the book, is a journalist. He's a writer for Esquire and Outdoor Magazine, Vanity Fair, several others. And so it comes through in his writing, and it's very well researched. A lot of the back is notes on where he's found this information that he has. He started an interest in children's literature. Of course, he was well read as a child because he's turned out to be a journalist. And when he got married and had children of his own, and he was reading bedtime stories, he went, hey, I know this story. And so he wanted to find out a little more about it, and that's how this book started. In 1997, Chelsea Clinton graduated from high school. Her father, who happened to be the sitting president of the United States at that time, was the commencement speaker, of course. And he addressed the class and said, please forgive your parents if they seem a little sad today and act a little weird. You see, they are remembering the first day of your schooling and all the triumphs and travails that went in between that day and today. And being Bill Clinton and the great orator he was, he went straight for the jugular. He said, you see, we long to hold you on our laps before you, like we did when you could barely walk. And one more time, read to you the stories of Goodnight Moon, Curious George, and the little engine who could. And don't you know, Chelsea and her friends were just rolling their eyes. But I dare say there was a parent or two in the audience who were wiping away tears, because these memories that he was evoking brings images of sippy cups and blankies and nighty-night, all those things. So he knew what he was talking about, and we have that feeling too. Whether or not you read books to children, whether or not they were read to you, books often have such an effect on us and how we think about things. And when we look at these children's books through 21st century eyes, we see them in a whole new way. Bill Clinton led off with Goodnight Moon, so let's start there. In the great green room, there was a red balloon and a telephone and a picture of a cow jumping over the moon and 3 little bears sitting in chairs and a pair of mittens and 2 young kittens. There's a toy house and a small mouse and a comb and a brush and a little old lady whispering, hush. That melodic rhythm has been putting children to sleep for years. There are some parents who swear by this book that their child has to have it before they can go to sleep. Well, let's look at this book a little deeper. The author is a woman named Margaret Wise Brown. She's an interesting character. We're going to talk about her a little bit in a minute, but the illustrator is a man named Clement Hurd. And this is the picture that Margaret Wise Brown sent to Clement Hurd to say, this is your inspiration for the illustrations in Goodnight Moon. Okay, now look at he does have a little lacy collar on him, but look at the flat color of his red suit. Now this is a child, it's a painting by Goya. It's called Boy in Red by Goya, Francisco Goya, and it's supposed to be a child in his playroom. Look at this child's toys. He has what looks to be a magpie on a leash And then you see two cats, but if you look real closely, you can see these evil eyes from another cat right behind the two. And I don't know about you, but I think those cats look mighty hungry because they're eyeing that magpie. And then on the other side, he has a cage, a bird cage with another bird in it. And this is depicting a child with his toys and these flat colors. And that's what she sent Clement Hurd to give him an inspiration. Now, this is the main picture in this. All kinds of questions arise to your adult eyes when you look at this. First of all, those yellow and green striped drapes, a decorator's nightmare. Who wants those drapes? And then you see the little toddler bunny in a gigantic bed with a telephone beside his bed. What does the toddler need a telephone for? That fireplace, the place is full of safety hazards. A toddler bunny could stumble into that fireplace and be burned in a minute. And then look at the bookshelf behind the little old lady whispering hush. It looks like it's stocked with encyclopedias. That bunny's not going to be interested in the encyclopedias, but the bunny is going to be interested in the toys that are on top of that bookshelf. And he's going to climb up there. The bookshelf is going to fall over him. He's going to be crushed. I mean, this is not a good situation. And sanitation, there's a mouse on every page of this book. And you see the comb and brush and the bowl full of mush? Well, if you brush a toddler bunny's hair, he's going to shed a lot. There's bound to be hair in that oatmeal over there. Also, where are the parents? Are they off at some fabulous party in New York City? Maybe they went to Palm Beach for the weekend. We don't know. Who's the little old lady? Is she somebody they picked up off the street? Is she a nanny? Is she a grandmother? We don't know. We do know that she wants that bunny to be quiet. If you look closely in the picture, there is a clock on the mantle and a clock beside the bed. And over the pages of those books, the time changes. And we learn that it takes that bunny a while to go to sleep. And I'm sure parents can identify with that. Also, in an early act of product placement, do you see the painting above the little old lady whispering hush? That is from an earlier book that Clement Hurd and Margaret Wise Brown did called Runaway Bunny. So if you like this book, look at this one too. That's product placement, right? Okay, Margaret Wise Brown was a New York City party girl. She liked shopping. She didn't like spending money unless it was for flowers, champagne, or clothes were the main things she wanted to buy. She was in the Cafe Society, even though she had an apartment in Greenwich Village where she kept a goat, a dog, a cat, and a flying squirrel in her apartment. So that was the kind of person she was. She came from a fairly well-to-do family and went to college at Highland College. She graduated full of creativity and wonderful ideas and went in to go to New York. Well, it was in the mid-30s. And there's no jobs for women. There's no jobs for anybody, but there's certainly no jobs for women in New York. So she decided, she went to Columbia and took some courses in writing. And she decided she'd like to be a teacher. She had been around children, and she liked the way they told stories and embellished things, and she liked the way they put words together. She thought, I could be a teacher. So she went to the Banks School, which was a progressive school of education that taught the here and now theory of education. It was that children related best to the things that they knew, they could touch, they could feel, they knew about them, just like in this book. That's why there's so many obviously everyday things in that picture. So she went to school and got a degree in teaching, and she got a job as a teacher. And the first job she got, she realized she may like children individually, but she didn't like children as a group. So teaching was not the best fit for her. Not the best fit. This is another illustrator that she worked with. You could see the style of Clement Hurd. This illustrator's name is Garth Williams. He also illustrated, think in your mind of the book Charlotte's Web. Garth Williams was the illustrator of that. But look at that little golden book Mr. Dog. That was the book I loved as a child. It's Mr. Dog, the dog who belonged to himself, that Margaret Wise Brown wrote. My kids hated it, so that's why this book is in such good shape. They never wanted me to read it to them. But it's about an independent dog. It fit Margaret Wise Brown just fine. But look at the detail in that. You could see every hair on that dog's head and every tatter on the straw hat. The difference in the illustrators she worked with is amazing to me. That's Margaret Wise Brown. You can see she was described in a article in Life magazine one time as a green-eyed, ash-haired beauty who had the look of the outdoors about her. And she did. She had a cabin in Maine. She became a best-selling children's author after she decided to quit teaching. She really made a couple of pretty good hits on books. And then she just kept churning out those children's books and working with different illustrators. Now, the interesting thing is Goodnight Moon, in its first year out, only sold 600 copies. And over the next 10 years, it only sold 700 more copies. It just did not sell very well. In 1955, it was mentioned in a parenting advice column, and sales went through the roof. Today, Goodnight Moon sells 800,000 copies each year. Somebody told me this evening at dinner that they always buy it as the baby gift. Margaret, her friends called her Brownie. One time Clement Hurd and his wife and their 2-year-old came to her cabin in Maine to stay for the weekend. And she fixed up a room for the 2-year-old. She thought that would be fun, and she fixed up a room for her. Except she put a tiger skin rug on the floor. And the little boy got there, and he looked at the tiger skin rug, burst into tears, and had to spend the weekend in his parents' room. Okay. Nope. That's backwards. Anyway, there's a tiger skin rug in Goodnight Moon, too. I think Clement Hurd put that in there as kind of a funny thing. We'll talk about that picture in a minute. Margaret Wise Brown never had any sustained relationship, a romantic relationship. She was with an older woman for about 20 years, and that older woman abused her, told her she wasn't very smart. You only write children's books. And when she finally broke up with her 20 years later, she met a man who was an heir to the Rockefeller fortune. He was 26, she was 42. They fell in love and decided to get married. Now, Mr. Rockefeller, as many of that generation were, was an adventurer because, he had the money and the leisure time to do something like that. They decided he was going to go to Panama, where he was having a new sailboat built. Margaret Brownie was going to go to France for a last visit with her friends. So they separated. He went to Panama, and he was going to get the boat ready. And then when she got there, they were going to get married and sail around the tip of South America and honeymoon in the South Pacific. So Brownie is in France, and she's experiencing stomach pains, and her friends take her to the hospital where she's operated on, and they remove her appendix. She'd had a ruptured appendix. She was in the hospital about 2 weeks, as was customary at the time. That wasn't surprising. It was 1952. And when she was getting ready to be released, she was going to go to her friend's house and rest for a while, and then sail to Panama to meet her fiancé. The nurse said, "How do you feel, Brownie?" And she said, "Just wonderful," and did a high kick to display how good she felt, and fell over dead. There was a blood clot. I know. There was a blood clot in her leg that caused her dislodged and went straight to her brain. So she died. She was buried in Maine at her cabin where her parents were buried, and her epitaph said, "Writer of songs and nonsense. Perhaps it should have said, 'Good night, nobody,'" which is a line from. This picture is Anna Sewell. Does anybody know what book she wrote? Black Beauty. Black Beauty is right. Anna was born in a Quaker family in England. And there have been stories about animals. Think all the way back to Aesop's fables. Now, those animals stood on their hind feet. They talked to one another. They got into trouble, trickery. They became friends. They had humanistic qualities. But the first full-length book to be written in the voice of an animal was Black Beauty. Anna Sewell had been to London, and she saw the way horses were treated by the carriage drivers, the grooms, the cabbies, the people that worked with horses in London. So she went there, and she had seen that. She came home and wrote the book, Black Beauty. The whole book is told in the voice of the horse, the beautiful horse. An interesting thing that happened during that time, a check rein was used. It was a rein, or a piece of leather attached to the horse's neck, a bridle around the horse's neck, and then attached to the carriage itself, which caused the horse to hold its head up. The ladies wanted their carriage horses to look fine and fancy, but it was very bad on the horse. Oh, I'm going too fast. Thank you, Jackson. That's the Black Beauty. And that's Black Beauty's friend Ginger in the background. When Black Beauty is a broken down old cab horse, she sees Ginger being toted away into the glue factory by another wagon. Black Beauty has wonderful masters and very bad masters, but that one just makes you cry. And that's what Anna Sewell intended in this book. The check rein that was used on the horse, Beauty describes as she goes home one day. She said, "What I suffered with that rein for 4 long months in my lady's carriage, it would be difficult to describe. Before that, I never knew what it was to froth at the mouth. But now the action of the sharp bit on my tongue and jaw and the constrained position of my head cause me to froth every evening when I go home after work. Besides that, there's a pressure on my windpipe, which often made my breathing very uncomfortable. When I came home from work, my neck and my chest were strained and painful, my mouth and tongue tender, and I felt worn and depressed." After this book went out, check reins fell out of fashion in London, and they weren't used anymore, and that book is credited with that. Another author that wrote about animals is Beatrix Potter. Now, Beatrix Potter's characters were cute, but she was never sentimental. The story we're going to tell about from Beatrix Potter tonight is the tale of Peter Rabbit. Now, Beatrix Potter was a tough cookie, and she told it like it is. This is Mrs. Rabbit dressing her beautiful children to go out and play. Now, I don't know why she dressed them in velvet coats and beautiful pink capes, but she did. She dressed them up. Peter even had beautiful shoes with the toes curved up. She dressed them up, and then she sent them out to play. And then she said, "And whatever you do, don't go in Mr. McGregor's garden. You see, your father did, and he had an accident, and Mrs. McGregor baked him into a pie." Now, I don't know if that's a good thing to tell your children or not, but it did scare the little girls. And the little girls' names are Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, of course. Peter Rabbit, however, was adventuresome. He's going to go into Mr. McGregor's garden. He slips through the gate. He begins to look around. Ooh, there's carrots, there's lettuce. He begins to have a little nibble. And here comes Mr. McGregor with a very sharp rake, chasing Peter Rabbit all through the garden. And Peter manages to hide behind a watering can, and hide inside a flower pot. He manages to elude Farmer McGregor. But now he realizes he's lost. He needs to find the gate to get out. So he looks around, and first he sees a field mouse, and she's scurrying away, and she has a green pea in her mouth. She's going home to feed her children, so she can't talk. And then he sees a white cat sitting by the koi pond, and he remembers that a cousin of his had a run-in with a cat. He decides not to bother the cat to ask for directions. So he wanders around the garden, avoiding Mr. McGregor until he finally sees the gate. He's going to make a dash for the gate. Mr. McGregor appears again with the rake. Peter loses his beautiful blue velvet coat. He loses his shoes. He goes back to his animal essence, and we see him in Beatrix Potter's illustration running on all fours, trying to get to the gate ahead of Mr. McGregor. He does, and when he gets home and he has to explain to his mother that he lost his velvet coat, Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail get berries and cream for supper, and Peter gets chamomile tea and sent to bed. We can't talk about children's books without talking about Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss was born Theodore Geisel in Springfield, Massachusetts. He came from a home where German was spoken at home, which might explain his rather convoluted relationship with the English language, is that German was actually his first language. Seuss was his mother's maiden name, and he's eventually going to decide to take that as his pen name. He said his father was a brewmaster in Springfield, Massachusetts, made the beer in the town, and he said if Prohibition hadn't come along, he would have been a beer maker as well. But it was Prohibition. His father got out of the beer making business and became the director of Parks and Recreation in Springfield, Massachusetts. So he had a job during the Depression, and the family was able to send Dr. Seuss to Dartmouth. While he was at Dartmouth, he joined the newspaper staff as a cartoonist. Can't you see that? All the funny things that he draws. Not surprising. However, he was caught in his room drinking gin one night. And the dean of Dartmouth said, "You are now banned from all extracurricular activities." So he couldn't draw his cartoons anymore. So it was at that time that he kept drawing cartoons, but instead of signing them T. Geisel, he signed them Seuss, just Seuss, supposedly being anonymous. So he kept on doing that. He graduated from Dartmouth, didn't know what he wanted to do. He thought, well, I like to read. I think I want to become a professor of English literature. His parents sent him to Oxford in England to study English literature. He's only there about a week before he meets a young woman named Helen Palmer, and they begin seeing each other. She notices that in his note-taking in English literature classes, he is drawing cartoon figures in the margins. And she says, "You don't need to become an English teacher. You need to keep up your drawing and become a cartoonist. And by the way, that's a very fine flying cow that you've drawn there." So Theodore, Ted, thinks about it, and he goes and talks to his professors, and they say, "Yeah, she's right. You really aren't doing very well in class. You might as well quit. You're not going to make a doctorate here." So he throws in the doctoral towel, hops on a freighter, and bums around Europe for about a year and a half. After that time, he goes back to New York City, finds Helen, and they get married. So now he really does need a job. He gets a job. He's writing a kind of freelancing in magazines as a cartoonist, New Yorker magazine, Look magazine, as an illustrator and a cartoonist. But they really want that Fifth Avenue apartment. So he gets a job with an advertising agency. Probably his best known ad was one where Flit was a bug spray. I think it even had one of those pump things that you sprayed bugs with. And his ad was a drawing of a woman cowering in fear as a giant mosquito attacked her, and she's yelling over her shoulder, "Honey, get the Flit." And that was probably his best known ad that sold a lot of product. One day he ran into a Dartmouth classmate, and mentioned he was looking for something to increase his income because he was only getting paid by the ad he would draw and then however much that was used. So it wasn't a steady income that he could depend upon. And his classmate said, "You ought to get in the brat book business." Brat book, children's literature. "You ought to get in that business." And he said, well, I don't know that I could. He said, oh, I remember all your funny things you drew. You could do that. I know you could do that. And by the way, that's my business, and this is my building, and I have an office on the 3rd floor. Let's go talk about it. So they did, and his first book was And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street. It was happily received, and he was drawing more and more, illustrating his own books, and he'd always been pretty good with a rhyme. He felt like he really hit his stride with Horton Hatches an Egg. And since it's one of my favorites, I can still remember my grandmother reading that to me. I wanted to share it with you. This is Horton. He's sitting on Maisie the lazy bird's egg. And he says, so Horton kept sitting there day after day, and soon it was autumn, the leaves blew away. And then came the winter, the snow and the sleet, and icicles hung from his trunk and his feet. But Horton kept sitting there and said with a sneeze, I'll stay on this egg and I won't let it freeze. For I meant what I said and I said what I meant, and an elephant's faithful 100%. So that's Horton. That would have been one of my favorite books. He keeps publishing books, and it becomes a pretty good income. And then comes World War II. Helen and Ted never had children, so they were pretty, free to go places. And they decide during the war, he gets a job offer to go to Hollywood and be a screenwriter. And he writes the scripts for training films and propaganda films for Warner Brothers. And he worked with people like Irving Wallace and John Huston. An interesting fact was after the war, he and Helen both liked the La Jolla lifestyle, and they stayed. And he is listed as a screenwriter on the movie Rebel Without a Cause, starring James Dean. Doesn't seem Dr. Seuss-like at all, but that's what he did get that credit. So he stayed out there, but he was also continuing to write those children's books. But by 1950, America was in an educational crisis. An author had published a book called Why Johnny Can't Read. Felt like the children of America were missing out on their reading skills. They weren't reading as well. And they blamed it on television and comic books. Textbook publishers looked inside themselves and says, we've got to have better books for the children to read. They were reading Dick and Jane, Run, Dick, Run. It was those namby-pamby, unnaturally clean, very polite children that the children were reading about. And the boys hated it. Well, Houghton Mifflin, a textbook publisher, put together a list of 100 words that had a first grade vocabulary. And they sent the list to several children's authors. And they said, write a book using just these words that first graders are going to love to read. Well, Ted Geisel looked at it and he said, if I'm trying to entertain a rhinoceros hunter in the first grade, I need more words than mother, father, spot, as, is, and thee. I need more words. I just can't write anything exciting just using these words. So he put the list aside. After about 2 weeks, he picked it up again, and he looked at the first 2 words that rhymed. It was cat and hat. And he's off. I know I'm pressing the right button. There he is. Cat and hat. And he's off. So it takes him about 9 months, but he writes The Cat in the Hat. Now, The Cat in the Hat used 222 words that a first grader could read. It was very popular. The story is, here's another absentee parent, like the toddler bunny, but this mother goes off for the day and says she's been gone all day, and the 2 children, named Dick and Sally, by the way, just like the children's books, it was rainy and they couldn't go out to play. The only visible babysitter she left with her children was a talking goldfish. So she leaves, and pretty soon there's a knock at the door, and it's this fella right here. And he comes in and he says, today is going to be a fun day. There are fun things to do. Let's get busy. And he does. He brings in thing one and thing two, and they tear up the house. The house is a total wreck by the end of the day. Suddenly, at the end of the day, late afternoon, the talking goldfish looks out the window and says, "Your mother's home. What are we going to do? Cat, you've got to get out of here." And he kicks the cat out of the house. Very sad, the cat leaves. Within minutes, seconds actually, the cat is back driving this Zamboni-like machine with picker-uppers that clean up the house. And the house is spotless. In the time it takes the mother to get from the sidewalk to the front door, the house becomes spotless. So the mother comes in and she says to Dick and Sally, they were just sitting there, "What did you do all day today?" And Dick and Sally look at each other, and here's what they say. "Sally and I did not know what to say. Should we tell her the things that went on there that day? Should we tell her about it? Now, what should we do?" "Well, what would you do if your mother asked you?" "Wait, what?" "Dr. Seuss is giving children permission to lie to their parents." Some people say the radical 60s started with the assassination of Martin Luther King. Some people say it was when the Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan. I say it was when Dr. Seuss gave children permission to lie to their clueless, the baby boomer children, to lie to their clueless parents. I'll leave that judgment up to you. You can decide for yourself. And did Dr. Seuss revolutionize the teaching of reading? Yes, he did in many ways. You're still reading children's teachers. I'm still reading. I read them to my children when they were little, and they're reading them to their children when they're little. And it's one of the first things that they'll read, especially the boys. Dr. Seuss, his two most popular books, Cat in the Hat and How the Grinch Stole Christmas, came about within a year of each other. He was, Helen, his beloved wife Helen, had a series of strokes, and he was caring for her and trying to keep publishing books. And after one morning, soon after Christmas, he got up in the morning and he went to the bathroom and he looked at himself in the mirror and he said, "That's a Grinch." He made up that word right there because he looked so haggard and tired and felt mean and felt ugly. After Helen died, he did remarry, and this time he married a woman with children. They were teenagers and young adults by then. And his stepdaughter said that on Ted's good days, he was the Cat in the Hat, and on his bad days, he was the Grinch. So that was how she described him. The next book I want to talk about is Little Women. Now, Little Women has been in the movie, had a movie made of it several times. This is one of the more recent ones. You recognize some of the stars. Hermione, Emma Watson, the actress who played Hermione on Harry Potter, gets to be Jo in this one. And we all gathered up our book clubs, women of our age, gathered up our book clubs, and we went to see the movie together. And then we read the books again in our bookstore, and we looked at it with different eyes. As 21st century eyes, it really is an anti-feminist novel. It really is hard. And the author, Louisa May Alcott, wanted Jo to end up without a husband because she was without a husband. She had no intention of ever marrying. And her publisher said, "No, you have to have Jo has a husband because that's what your readers will want." And so who does she have Jo marry? An older man who's a professor of German. Totally unexpected. She gives up Laurie, the handsome, fun young man, to her sister Amy, and she marries Professor Bayer. And who among us didn't cry when Beth died? And yet the day before Beth died, she called Jo to her bedside, and she said, "You must take my place, Jo, and be everything to Father and Mother when I'm gone. They'll turn to you. Don't fail them. You'll be happier in doing that than writing splendid books or seeing the world. For love is the only thing that we can carry with us when we go, and it makes the end so easy." "I'll try, Beth," Jo said. And then and there, Jo renounced her old ambitions and pledged herself to a new and better one, acknowledging the poverty of other desires. Were we crying over Beth's death, or were we crying at the death of all of Jo's dreams? Louisa May Alcott never married, and she wrote several other books and sequels to Little Women as well. If I'm going to talk about Little Women, I have to talk about another book that boys were more likely to read. This one is by Robert Louis Stevenson, and it's called Treasure Island. It's an action-adventure story, and Robert Louis Stevenson was mainly a travel writer. He wrote A Child's Garden of Verses and dedicated it to his nurse, his nanny, when he was a child. But mostly he wrote travel and adventure books. And he wrote this one in 1881, so 20 years or so after Little Women, but contemporary times. In the summer of 1881, when he started writing it, he wrote to a friend and he says, "I'm writing a new book, and if this don't fetch the kids, well, then they've gone rotten since my day. Will you be surprised to learn that it is about buccaneers, and it begins in the Admiral Benbow's public house, and that it's all about a map and a treasure and a mutiny and a derelict ship? It's quite silly and horrid fun, but what I want is the best book about buccaneers that can be had." And there's some argument for saying that he accomplished that. But on the other hand, kids don't like to read it. Roger Ebert, the movie critic, years later said he was having a conversation with someone who said, "I never met a kid that read Treasure Island and liked it." And Kidnapped, I never met a kid that liked mostly, and Ebert said his familiarity with it came from the classic comics, those series of comic books that were an illustrated classic story. That was his experience. So he went back and read it as an adult. He read Treasure Island, and then he read Kidnapped, and then he read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And his conclusion was that those books did not belong on the children's shelf between Winnie the Pooh and Peter Pan. They belonged on the adult shelf between Conrad and Jack London. And that's probably true. Robert Louis Stevenson himself, this was rather bohemian. He wore his hair long, and he fancied velvet smoking jackets. He didn't marry until late in life, and he's in pretty ill health most of his life. Do you remember in Child's Garden of Verses, The Land of Counterpane, when I was sick and lay abed and had two pillows at my head, and he made little hills with his toy soldiers over them? That's what he did to entertain himself. No TV in those days, If you have a sick child today, you immediately turn the TV on. So this was his lifestyle. He married late in life a woman who'd been divorced who had two children. They were romantically involved in Scotland, where he lived, and she went back to the United States, and that's when he decided he was going to marry her. So he gets on a boat across the Atlantic Ocean, and then a series of stagecoaches and trains all the way across the continent of North America to get to her in San Francisco. It ruined his health. By the time he got to San Francisco, he was weak, ill from tuberculosis, and his to-be wife nursed him back to health over the course of 6 months. So they did get married. They lived several places, but where they found they were happiest was in the South Pacific. They moved to Samoa. He became very beloved in Samoa. He was writing more and more of these travel books and travel and adventure stories. He died in Samoa, and just before he died, he wrote this poem that you'll be familiar with too. He said, "Under the wide and starry sky, dig my grave and let me lie, let me die. Here gladly did I live and gladly did I die, and I laid me down with a will. This be the verse you grave for me, here he lies where he longed to be. Home is the sailor home from the sea, and the hunter home from the hill." And that's what's engraved on his tombstone. The next book I want to talk about is Charlotte's Web. Now, remember I told you Garth Williams was the illustrator for Mr. Dog, Margaret Weiss Brown's books. He's the illustrator for that one too. The author is E.B. White. E.B. White was an essayist, and he started his first children's book, Stuart Little, for his niece, who was about 10 years old at the time. And he took him 2 years to finish it, but he exaggerated and said, by the time I finished it, she was reading Hemingway and wasn't interested in anything I had to write. So he loved animals. He liked telling stories about animals. Stuart Little is about a mouse-like creature. He's never called a mouse, but he's adopted by a family in New York. He gets to go sailing on the little sailboats in Central Park. He gets to travel around with the family. But his next book was called Charlotte's Web. Now, he had also worked in advertising during this time. He was an essayist. He was writing for magazines. He worked in advertising, and then he started writing Charlotte's Web. It took him 2 years to write Charlotte's Web. It still took him that long to write it. But he set it aside for a couple of months to let it ripen and to have Garth Williams work on the illustrations. The publisher said, Charlotte is the real heroine of this book. So you've got to make her attractive. Well, spiders have hairy legs and 8 eyes. You can't make a spider attractive. And so you never see Charlotte up close. You see her this far away. And people are looking at her adoringly. You know the story. Wilbur the pig was born the runt of the litter. And Fern, the little girl in the picture's father, was going to go kill him because he was the runt. He wasn't going to make it. And Fern begged him to let her raise the pig. So she did. Fern raised the pig Wilbur from the time he was a tiny, tiny piglet. But then Wilbur does grow and get bigger. And his owners are thinking bacon. So they talk about it in front of Wilbur. Wilbur has made friends with all of the animals in the barnyard. He thinks the cows are rather stupid. The horse often has wise advice. The geese talk way too much. And Templeton the rat is rather sneaky and stealthy and sly. But his favorite friend is Charlotte, who lives up in the rafters. She has a lovely, high-pitched voice, and she gives him very wise advice, and she's so friendly. She's his best friend. So when Wilbur hears the farmer talking about bacon and taking him to the butcher, Wilbur throws himself on his friend's pity and says, I don't want to die. I don't want to die. And so Charlotte said, let me think, what can I do? So she gets Templeton to chew a page out of a dictionary and bring it to her. And she chooses a word that she writes into a web. Her first word that she writes into the web is some pig, 2 words. Some pig she writes into her web that she spins overnight. The farmer anxiously goes out to the barn the next morning and he's feeding the animals and he looks up to the spider's web right above Wilbur and it says some pig. This is fantastic. He goes into the house, gets his wife to come out and says, look at this, we've got some pig down here. And his wife said, did you ever think you might have some spider? Because she was the one who wrote, or the spider was the one who wrote it. No, it says some pig right there. This is some pig. Remember, he was in advertising before he wrote this book. So the story goes on and on. Every time the web needs replacing, Charlotte writes something in the web, a word she finds in the dictionary. She wrote radiant, terrific, all of those things to describe Wilbur. People came from far around, all over the country, to see Wilbur in the pig pen. And Wilbur was very happy and very proud. The farmer was so excited that he decided he would take Wilbur to the county fair. With all the other animals that he was going to show. So they all go to the county fair, and Charlotte hitches a ride with them, as does Templeton the rat. When they get to the fair, Charlotte writes in her web the word humble. So very proudly and very humbly, Wilbur takes a bow. As the fair goes on, Charlotte tells Wilbur that it's her time to die. Now, this book may be the first book that children encounter where death actually happens. E.B. White handles it very well. Wilbur says, I don't want you to die. You're my friend. And Charlotte says, it's my time. And besides, I'm leaving this egg sack with 514 of my children in it. And they will become your friends too. So that night, after the fair was over, everyone had been packing up, and these touching words about death is what E.B. White wrote. He said, the next day, the Ferris wheel was being taken apart, and the race horses were being loaded into vans, and entertainers packed up their belongings to leave and drove away. Charlotte died. The fairgrounds were soon deserted. The sheds and fields were empty and forlorn. The infield was littered with trash and bottles. Nobody of the hundreds of people who had attended the fair knew that a small gray spider had played the most important role of all. No one was with her when she died. Now, E.B. White gives Charlotte her privacy when she died, that he did not write an agonizing story of Charlotte's death. And she died alone, but that's what spiders do. Spiders do die alone. White does provide a happy ending, however. Templeton the rat carefully chews the egg sac and brings it down to Wilbur, who keeps it in his mouth on the ride back to the farm. And then he has Templeton attach it to the rafters again. And sure enough, the next spring, the sack burst open, and 514 tiny spiders with their parachutes go drifting away. And Wilbur says, wait, don't leave. I want you to be my friends. And suddenly, a high voice that sounds a lot like Charlotte from up in the rafters said, we'll stay. And 3 of Charlotte's daughters do stay with Wilbur and become his friends. We are told that over the years, many generations of Charlotte's children, grandchildren, and great-great-great-grandchildren become Wilbur's friends and know all the animals in the barn. E.B. White closes the story with some of the best words that I think happen in children's literature, because he's going to talk about the glory of everything. He talks about some things that are bad and smelly like manure, and then the glory of everything. So listen to E.B. White's words there. Wilbur is sitting in his pig pen, and he looks around and he says, this is the place to be, thought Wilbur. The warm, delicious cellar with the garrulous geese, the heat of the sun, the passage of the swallows, the nearness of rats, and the sameness of the sheep, the love of spiders, the smell of manure, and the glory of everything. Isn't that wonderful to think that Wilbur can find glory in everything? I have to close this report with Where the Wild Things Are. Several people have said that was my kid's favorite book, and it's a favorite book to many kids, and it's a scary book to some other kids. And it goes like this. The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind and another, his mother called him Wild Thing, and he said, I'll eat you up. So he was sent to his room without eating anything. That very night in Max's room, a forest grew and grew and grew until the ceiling hung with vines, and the walls became the world all around. And an ocean tumbled by with a private boat just for Max. And he sailed through days and in and out of weeks and almost over a year to the land where the wild things are. And the story goes on about the wild rumpus and all the things the wild things do until Max wants to go home where someone loves him best of all. And he goes home, and his room has become his room again, and his supper is there, and it was still warm. Someone does love him best of all. So it's a good message for children. Now, the author is Maurice Sendak. He grew up in a Jewish neighborhood in Brooklyn, an only child, and this was going to be the land of the wild horses, but he found he couldn't draw horses very well. So he was going to make them monsters. And he remembered when he was growing up, when his Jewish relatives were come and visit, and they would pinch his cheeks and say, "Oh, you're just so cute, I could eat you up." And his mother was the slowest cook in Brooklyn, so he was afraid they really might eat him up. So he used them as role models for his monsters. That was where he got the idea for his monsters. He was an interesting fella, and like I said, the book was either really popular with kids. He wrote several other books, some of which were banned, and because of his innovative illustrations. And but one time he got a letter from a child, a fan letter, and he wrote back, and he drew some little pictures on it and sent a letter back to the little boy. He later met the mother, and the mother said, "My son was so happy to get your letter that he ate it." And I'm sure she was thinking of the thousands of dollars that would fetch with an original Dr. Seuss. Another time, a mother told him, I read your book to my daughter every night, and she cried every night." He said, "Why are you tormenting your child?" And she said, "Well, it is a Caldecott winner, the medal for illustrating." This book was so good, and there was so much more in it that I did not have time to talk about. You can talk about Little House on the Prairie, fairy tales, the Brothers Grimm, Ramona Quimby, Narnia. All of those things are included in this book, and we just don't have time to cover them all. But I wanted to close with an excerpt from one of the very first children's books published in the colonies, 1690. Now, obviously, this was not the golden era of children's literature, because the book started with a list of rules for children. It said, first, love God, use no ill words, fear God, tell no lies, serve God, cheat not in your play, strive to learn, play not with bad boys, and be not a dunce. Now, granted, this is pretty good advice for children, but I don't know that they would be interested in reading it in that particular form. And so I think our children today are very grateful to have even newer books than the ones we talked about here, but the Dr. Seuss and Goodnight Moon and all of those we talked about. I think children today are going to enjoy them much more than those rules. So thank you all for having me.
You know, next week we'll see that picture of you. I was just going to say, it's going to make me want to maybe just call Jane and say, "Can I come over and sit in your lap and you can read me a story?" Well, I'll see if I can find a picture. So the great thing about Dana is, in addition to being a great book reviewer, she's also one of the best members of our committee, and it makes things so much easier every year when we put our lineup of reviewers together, and knowing we can always plug her in. So thank you very much. Next week we have an author, Marjorie Herrera Lewis, When the Men Were Gone. Is that right? When the Men Were Gone. So everybody sweat a bunch, and we'll see you next Wednesday.